Hey, one of the most common arguments in favour of this voice to Parliament is, hey, we've tried everything else, nothing seems to work, so we may as well give this a go. That's a really bad argument. It's kind of like a couple of people on the road in a broken down car, and they've looked at the engine, they've sort of tried to figure out how to fix it, and they can't do it, and so one of them says, oh, okay, well, look, why don't we pour Coke in the fuel tank? Hey, we've tried everything else, let's give this a go. The problem is that if you try the wrong thing, you could actually make things even worse. And who says that we've tried everything else anyway? The thing is that, 80%, around about 80% of Indigenous Australians are not living in poverty, do not have shockingly bad health conditions. In actual fact, they're living roughly on parity with non-Indigenous Australians. So we must be doing something right. It's the 20% of Indigenous Australians who are doing really badly, and they're the ones who most need help. And we kind of know why the 80% are doing well. Why? Because they have integrated themselves into mainstream Australian society. They have undergone a mainstream education. They've become part of the mainstream economy, and they've also left the far regions in Australia where there are no jobs, where there are very little sort of social services, and again they've come into the main hubs. So we kind of have a pretty good idea of how to help Indigenous Australians who are doing really badly, how to help them to do better. We kind of know how to do it. The problem is that this is all very controversial. There are other things that we know that work as well, but they're controversial. So, for example, we know that alcohol bans reduce the rates of domestic violence, reduce the rates of Indigenous Australians going into hospitals requiring surgery. But there are many people who say alcohol bans are racist. We know that, that sit-down money takes away all incentive for people to really sort of have to sort of do much with their lives. That's a big problem. But again, if you were to suggest that we sort of whittle down the sit-down money, again, we would be called racist. We would be called heartless. We also know that the Aboriginal industry is a vast bureaucratic web that is very, very tangled, very often inefficient, plagued with its own tribal, Indigenous family politics, and that is in many respects quite dysfunctional. But again, if you say that, you're accused of being a racist. And the thing is, these problems that I've just mentioned, these are not things that the voice to Parliament is going to solve. There's just no reason to think that the voice will fix this. All the voice will do will add another political, bureaucratic layer for many of these disputes just to be fought out there as well. It's almost certainly not going to help. But the other problem with the whole we've tried everything else, so let's try the voice, justification for the voice, is that it just assumes that either government is the cause of the problems of Indigenous Australians, or the problems of Indigenous Australians can only be fixed by the government. This is just a really bad way of thinking about things, and we've got to listen to people like Jacinta Price, Warren Mundine, Anthony Dillon and others who say, look, Indigenous Australians need to actually look at their own ways. They need to look at their own culture, and they need to ask themselves, what things do we need to change about ourselves to improve our standards of living and to improve our chances of being able to integrate properly into the mainstream economy so that we can do as well as everyone else. And I just remind you again, the overwhelming majority of people who identify as Aboriginal have done this. So being Aboriginal does not by definition mean that you are impoverished and in horrible health. Again, it is a minority of Indigenous Australians who are like this. So do we need a voice to bring Indigenous Australians who are suffering out of that condition? Well, the fact is 80% of Indigenous Australians do not live in those conditions, and they have achieved that without a voice. This voice to Parliament will prove to be pretty unhelpful to the worst off Indigenous Australians, and B, it will prove to be highly divisive, as it very quickly will settle into a perpetual call for a divisive treaty. Vote no to the Voice.